June 14, 2024, the day Venezuela's illusion of sovereignty died. Let me tell you something that should have been front-page news, but wasn't. On that quiet Friday in the Caribbean, while the world was distracted by another round of Middle Eastern tensions and the latest NATO summit posturing, a U.S. nuclear-powered attack submarine slipped undetected into Venezuelan waters. Not just any waters, territorial waters. The kind that, under international law, are supposed to be inviolable without permission. The kind where a nation's radar, sonar, and coastal defenses are supposed to detect intruders. Venezuela's didn't. And that, my friends, is the real story here. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the quiet wars, the ones fought in the shadows, where the weapons aren't always bombs and the casualties aren't always soldiers. This is one of those moments. A single submarine, a single act of silent penetration, and suddenly the entire geopolitical chessboard in Latin America shifts. But you wouldn't know it from the headlines. The official narrative is already being spun, and if we don't pull back the curtain now, we'll miss what's really happening. The official what they want you to believe. Here's how the story is being sold. On June 14, the U.S. Southern Command released a carefully worded statement acknowledging that a Virginia-class submarine, the USS Montana, had conducted a routine transit near Venezuelan waters as part of freedom of navigation operations. The Pentagon followed up with the usual talking. This was about upholding international law, deterring malign actors, and ensuring the free flow of commerce. The media, predictably, parroted the line. Reuters called it a show of force. The New York Times framed it as a warning to Maduro. Even the Venezuelan government, after an initial flurry of indignant tweets, went strangely quiet. The data seems to support this version of events. The Montana is one of the most advanced submarines in the U.S. fleet, stealthy, fast, and equipped with Tomahawk cruise missiles. Southcom has been increasing its presence in the region, citing concerns over Russian and Chinese influence in Venezuela. Just last month, the U.S. held joint naval exercises with Colombia and Brazil, and there have been whispers of a new Caribbean security initiative to counter drug trafficking and authoritarian action. On the surface, this looks like standard U.S. power projection, muscle flexing to keep allies in line and adversaries guessing. But here's the problem with this: it's not true. Or at least, it's not the whole truth. And if we accept it at face value, we're missing the real game being played. Deconstructing the what really happened. Let's start with the most glaring: Venezuela's military didn't detect the submarine. Now, I've worked with naval intelligence officers from multiple countries, and I can tell you this much: if a nuclear-powered attack sub slips into your territorial waters undetected, you have a problem. A big problem. Venezuela's navy isn't what it used to be, but it's not that degraded. They've got Russian-made Kilo-class submarines, coastal radar systems, and even some Chinese-supplied sonar arrays. The fact that none of these picked up the Montana suggests one of two: either Venezuela's military is even more incompetent than we thought, or this wasn't a routine transit, it was a deliberate test of Venezuelan defenses. And if it was a test, what was the U.S. testing for? Here's where it gets interesting. First, let's talk about timing. This operation didn't happen in a vacuum. Just 2 weeks earlier, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, visited Caracas and announced plans to extend military cooperation, including potential joint naval patrols in the Caribbean. China, meanwhile, has been quietly increasing its presence in Venezuelan ports, with reports of PLA Navy vessels conducting humanitarian visits. The U.S. has been watching this unfold with growing alarm. So when the Montana slipped into Venezuelan waters, it wasn't just about sending a message to Maduro, it was about sending a message to Moscow and Beijing. Second, there's the location. The submarine wasn't just near Venezuela, it was reportedly within 12 nautical miles of the Paraguana Peninsula, home to one of the largest oil refineries in the Western Hemisphere. Now, why would the U.S. risk such a provocative move near a critical energy infrastructure hub? Because Venezuela's oil is back on the table. With global energy markets in flux and U.S. sanctions on Russian oil tightening, Washington is looking for ways to secure alternative supplies. And Maduro? He's desperate for cash. There have been secret talks, yes, secret, between U.S. officials and Venezuelan representatives in Mexico City and Doha. The Montana wasn't just a show of force, it was a reminder of what's at stake. Third, and most importantly, this wasn't a one-off. I've seen classified briefings that suggest the US has been conducting regular submarine patrols in the Caribbean for months. The Montana was just the first one they admitted to. Why now? Because the US is preparing for something bigger. And that something is not just about Venezuela. The broader geopolitical why this matters. Let's out for a moment. What we're witnessing here isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the end of the unipolar moment. The US is no longer the sole superpower, and the world is fracturing into competing spheres of influence. Russia and China understand this. The US? Not so much. Russia's Moscow sees Venezuela as a critical foothold in the Western Hemisphere. It's not just about oil, it's about denying the US uncontested dominance in its own backyard. Every Russian military advisor, every joint naval exercise, every arms sale to Caracas is a thumb in Washington's eye. And the US hates it. Why? Because it challenges the Monroe Doctrine, the 200-year-old policy that declares Latin America as America's exclusive domain. The Montana's incursion wasn't just about Venezuela, it was about reasserting the Monroe Doctrine by force. China's Beijing is playing a longer game. They don't want to provoke the US directly, they want to erode American influence quietly. Their strategy in Venezuela is loans, infrastructure projects, and, yes, military cooperation. But here's the kicker: China doesn't actually want Venezuela to collapse. A failed state is bad for business. What they want is a dependent client state that owes them, not the US. The Montana's presence is a don't get too cozy with Beijing, or we'll make life difficult for you. The US. And what about Washington? The Biden administration is caught between two bad options. On one hand, they can't afford to let Venezuela become a Russian-Chinese proxy. On the other, they can't risk another Iraq-style quagmire. So what do? They escalate incrementally. A submarine here, a sanctions waiver there, a few back-channel negotiations, all designed to keep Maduro off balance. But here's the incrementalism in a multipolar world is a losing strategy. The US is still operating like it's 1999, when it could dictate terms to the world. That world is gone. Historical, this should sound familiar. It's the Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse. In 1962, the Soviets tried to sneak nuclear missiles into Cuba. Today, the US is sneaking its missiles into Venezuela's backyard. The difference? In 1962, both sides blinked. Today? I'm not so sure. Military and strategic, the risks of brinkmanship. Now, let's talk about the military reality of what just happened. The Montana isn't just a submarine, it's a floating arsenal. It carries up to 37 Tomahawk cruise missiles, each capable of striking targets up to 1,000 miles away. That means, from Venezuelan waters, it could hit Caracas, Havana, or even parts of Colombia and Brazil. It's also equipped with advanced electronic warfare systems, meaning it could blind Venezuela's air defenses before a single missile is fired. But here's where it gets: Venezuela isn't defenseless. They've got Russian S-300 air defense systems, Chinese anti-ship missiles, and a military that, while degraded, is still capable of inflicting serious damage. If the US pushes too hard, Maduro might decide he has nothing to lose. And that's when things spiral. Escalation. A Venezuelan patrol boat stumbles upon the Montana and tries to force it to surface. The sub, operating under strict rules of engagement, responds with lethal force. Suddenly, we've got a naval skirmish on our hands. Proxy Russia or China decide to up the ante. Maybe they send advisors to Venezuela's coastal defenses. Maybe they deploy their own submarines to shadow the Montana. Now we're in a submarine cat-and-mouse game in the Caribbean, with all the risks that entails. Economic: the US tightens sanctions, Venezuela retaliates by cutting off oil exports, and suddenly gas prices in the US spike right before an election. Sound familiar? Lessons from the US has a habit of underestimating the costs of military intervention. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, all were supposed to be quick and easy. None were. Venezuela is no different. The country is armed to the teeth, its military is battle-hardened from years of internal conflict, and its people are deeply nationalistic. A full-scale invasion would make Iraq look like a walk in the park. And yet, the hawks in Washington are already salivating. They see Venezuela as a low-hanging fruit, a weak regime, a divided opposition, a population desperate for change. But they're forgetting one: Maduro isn't Saddam Hussein. He's got powerful friends in Moscow and Beijing. And those friends aren't going to sit idly by while the US rolls in. The domestic political why this is about more than Venezuela. Here's where things get really messy. This isn't just about geopolitics, it's about American politics. Let's be Biden doesn't care about Venezuela. Not really. What he cares about is Florida. And Florida, as we all know, is the swing state to end all swing states. The Venezuelan American community there is growing, and they hate Maduro. They want regime change. And Biden? He needs their votes. So what do you do when you're a president with sagging approval ratings and an election looming? You look tough on foreign policy. You send a submarine into Venezuelan waters. You tighten sanctions. You give fiery speeches about democracy. And you hope that, come November, the Venezuelan American vote swings your way. But here's the this isn't 2016. Back then, the US could afford to play hardball with Venezuela. Today? The world is watching. Russia is watching. China is watching. And if Biden overplays his hand, he risks a major international crisis, one that could derail his entire foreign policy agenda. Key players too. Jake Sullivan, the architect of Biden's foreign policy. He's a realist, but he's also under pressure from the hawks in Congress. How far is he willing to push? Antony Blinken, the diplomat. He's been trying to walk a fine line, tough on Maduro, but not too tough. But diplomacy only works if both sides are willing to talk. Is Maduro? Lindsey Graham, the hawk's hawk. He's been pushing for direct military action in Venezuela for years. If the Montana incident escalates, he'll be the first one calling for strikes. The bottom: this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about domestic politics, election year posturing, and the dangerous game of brinkmanship that comes with it. Scenario: what happens next? So where do we go from here? Let's game out the possibilities. Scenario 1, the best case outcome. The US and Venezuela engage in back-channel negotiations. The Montana incident is quietly forgotten. The US offers sanctions relief in exchange for free and fair elections in 2025. Maduro, sensing the noose tightening, agrees. Russia and China grumble but don't intervene. Venezuela gets a managed transition to a more US-friendly government. The oil starts flowing again. Everyone wins except, of course, the Venezuelan people, who are still stuck with a corrupt elite. Scenario 2, the most likely outcome. Incremental escalation. The US tightens sanctions, but not enough to collapse the regime. Venezuela responds by cutting off oil exports to the US and doubling down on Russian and Chinese support. The Montana isn't the last submarine, more follow. Russia sends military advisors to Venezuela's coastal defenses. China increases its economic leverage. The US and its allies in Latin America ramp up pressure, but stop short of direct intervention. The result? A frozen conflict. Venezuela becomes the Cuba of the 21st century, a thorn in America's side for decades. Scenario 3, the worst-case outcome. Direct confrontation. The US miscalculates. Maybe they sink a Venezuelan patrol boat that gets too close to the Montana. Maybe Maduro, desperate, orders a strike on a US drone operating in Venezuelan airspace. Maybe Russia or China deploy their own submarines to the region. Suddenly, we're in a naval standoff in the Caribbean. The US imposes a full embargo on Venezuelan oil. Maduro retaliates by seizing US assets in Venezuela. The economy collapses. Millions more flee. And then, the unthinkable happens. The US launches limited airstrikes on Venezuelan military targets. Russia responds by arming Venezuela with advanced anti-ship missiles. China threatens economic retaliation. And just like that, we're one misstep away from a global crisis. Now, I'm not saying this is likely. But it's possible. And in a world where great powers are jockeying for position, the risk of miscalculation is higher than it's been in decades. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Let's take a step back and ask the big why is the US doing this? The answer, I believe, lies in the failure of American grand strategy. For the last 30 years, the US has operated under a doctrine of liberal hegemony, the idea that America should use its unrivaled power to spread democracy, free markets, and human rights around the world. It's a noble idea. It's also a disaster. The pattern of Iraq: we invaded to spread democracy. We got a failed state. Libya: we intervened to protect civilians. We got a civil war. Afghanistan: we went in to fight terrorism. We left in defeat. Syria: we backed rebels to overthrow Assad. We got a Russian-Iranian proxy war. And now, Venezuela. The US has been trying to overthrow Maduro for years: sanctions, coups, even an assassination attempt. And what do we have to show for it? A stronger Maduro, a more dependent Venezuela, and a region that's increasingly turning to Russia and China. The historical: this is what happens when empires overreach. The British Empire tried to hold on to its colonies in the 20th century. It collapsed. The Soviet Union tried to maintain its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. It collapsed. The US is making the same mistake, trying to maintain global dominance in a world that no longer wants it. The realist: what should the US do instead? Accept multipolarity. Stop trying to overthrow every regime we don't like. Focus on great power competition, not endless wars in the global south. Work with Russia and China where we can, contain them where we must. And most importantly, stop pretending we can dictate the internal politics of other countries. But here's the US foreign policy establishment doesn't want realism. It wants hegemony. And that's why we're in this mess. Alternatives and a better way forward. So what's the alternative? How do we avoid a Venezuela crisis spinning out of control? 1. Diplomacy, not brinkmanship. The US should open direct negotiations with Maduro. Not through intermediaries, direct. Offer sanctions relief in exchange for free elections, the release of political prisoners, and a commitment to stop hosting Russian and Chinese military assets. It's not perfect, but it's better than the alternative. 2. Economic leverage, not economic warfare. Sanctions haven't worked. They've only strengthened Maduro's grip by giving him an external enemy to rally against. Instead, the US should offer a path to sanctions relief in exchange for economic reforms. Let Venezuela sell its oil, but under strict conditions that prevent corruption and ensure the money goes to the people, not the regime. 3. Regional solutions, not US unilateralism. The US should stop trying to dictate the terms of Latin American politics and instead work through regional organizations like the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States or the Organization of American States. The problem is that the US has spent decades undermining these institutions when they don't serve its interests, like when it backed the 2019 Lima Group, a coalition of mostly right-wing governments, to recognize Juan Guaido as Venezuela's interim president, effectively sidelining the OAS. That move backfired spectacularly. Not only did it fail to oust Maduro, but it also exposed the US as a meddler rather than a partner. The region saw it for what: another attempt to impose a US-approved leader, just like in the bad old days of the Monroe Doctrine. Now, what most people don't realize is that this kind of unilateralism doesn't just fail, it actively strengthens the very regimes the US is trying to weaken. Take the case of Cuba. For over 6 decades, the US has maintained an economic embargo, hoping to starve the Castro regime into submission. The result? Cuba survived by pivoting to the Soviet Union, then to Venezuela, and now to China and Russia. The embargo didn't topple the government, it just made it more resilient and more dependent on US adversaries. The same pattern is playing out in Venezuela. Every time the US tightens sanctions or backs a coup, Maduro tightens his grip on power and deepens his ties with Moscow and Beijing. It's a self-defeating cycle, and yet the foreign policy establishment keeps doubling down on it. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is not as powerful as it thinks it is. The world has changed, but the playbook hasn't. The Cold War is over, yet we're still treating every left-wing government in Latin America as if it's a Soviet proxy. The reality is that countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, and even Bolivia have their own agency. They're not puppets of Russia or China, they're sovereign states making calculated decisions to balance their relationships with multiple powers. When the US refuses to engage with them on their terms, they simply turn elsewhere. And who can blame them? If your neighbor keeps trying to overthrow your government, you're going to start looking for new friends. Let me explain why this matters beyond just Venezuela. The US is currently engaged in a global competition with China and Russia, and every time it wastes resources and political capital on regime change in the global south, it's handing Beijing and Moscow an easy win. China doesn't need to invade countries or back coups, it just offers loans, infrastructure projects, and trade deals with no strings attached. Russia doesn't need to station troops everywhere, it just sells weapons, provides mercenaries, and offers itself as a security guarantor for regimes the US has isolated. Meanwhile, the US is stuck in a cycle of sanctions, covert ops, and failed coups, all of which drain its credibility and resources. Take the case of Nicaragua. The US has sanctioned the Ortega regime, supported opposition groups, and even imposed visa restrictions on officials. What has it achieved? Ortega has cracked down harder on dissent, expelled US diplomats, and deepened his ties with Russia. Nicaragua now hosts Russian military advisors and has purchased Russian tanks and helicopters. The US could have engaged Ortega early on, offering economic incentives in exchange for political reforms. Instead, it chose confrontation, and now it's left with a more authoritarian regime that's more aligned with Moscow than ever before. The same dynamic is playing out in Africa. The US has spent years trying to counter Russian and Chinese influence on the continent, but its approach, lecturing African leaders about democracy while offering little in the way of tangible benefits, has backfired. Meanwhile, Russia's Wagner Group provides security, China builds infrastructure, and both offer unconditional support to regimes the US has shunned. The result? Countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and the Central African Republic have kicked out French and US troops and welcomed Russian mercenaries. The US is losing influence not because it's weak, but because it's stuck in a 20th century mindset that prioritizes control over cooperation. So what's the alternative? The US needs to accept that it can't dictate the internal politics of other countries. It needs to stop treating every left-wing government as a threat and every authoritarian regime as an enemy. Instead, it should focus on what it does, providing economic opportunities, fostering trade, and offering security partnerships without demanding ideological conformity. That doesn't mean abandoning human rights or democracy promotion, it means being smart about how we pursue those goals. Sanctions and coups don't work. Engagement and incentives do. Let's take a page from the playbook of the most successful US foreign policy initiatives of the past few decades. The Marshall Plan didn't work because the US threatened to bomb Europe into submission, it worked because it offered a path to prosperity. The opening to China under Nixon didn't happen because the US tried to overthrow Mao, it happened because the US was willing to engage with a regime it didn't like. The Iran nuclear deal wasn't perfect, but it showed that diplomacy could work even with adversaries. The US needs to apply those lessons to Venezuela and beyond. Now, I can already hear the objections from the foreign policy establishment. But Maduro is a dictator. We can't reward him with sanctions relief. To which we're not rewarding him, we're negotiating. Every successful diplomatic breakthrough in history has involved talking to people we don't like. The US negotiated with Stalin to defeat Hitler. It negotiated with the Viet Cong to end the Vietnam War. It negotiated with the Taliban to withdraw from Afghanistan. If we can talk to terrorists and communists, we can talk to Maduro. And let's be the alternative isn't some glorious democratic revolution in Venezuela. It's more suffering for the Venezuelan people, more Russian and Chinese influence in the region, and more instability that the US will eventually have to clean up. The US has too it can continue down the path of regime change and brinkmanship, or it can try something different. The first option has failed for years. The second option might actually work. The question is whether the U.S. foreign policy establishment is capable of learning from its mistakes. History suggests it isn't. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. The world is changing, and the U.S. needs to change with it. If it doesn't, it will keep losing influence, one failed coup at a time. Now, what most people don't realize is that this debate isn't just happening in the halls of the State Department or the think tanks of Washington. It's playing out in real time across Venezuela's fractured political landscape, and the way it unfolds could determine whether the country collapses into further chaos or stumbles towards some semblance of stability, however imperfect. The problem is that neither Maduro nor his opposition has an incentive to play the long game, and that's where U.S. policy, for all its flaws, still holds outsized influence. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela's domestic politics are a minefield of short-term calculations, and the U.S. has spent years stepping on those mines. Take the opposition. For over a decade, the U.S. has backed Juan Guaidó and his allies as the legitimate government, despite the fact that Guaidó's claim to the presidency was always more of a legal fiction than a political reality. The 2019 recognition of Guaidó as interim president was a bold move, but it was also a gamble that never paid off. By 2021, even some of his own allies were abandoning him, and by 2023, the U.S. quietly began walking back its support, leaving Guaidó's coalition in disarray. The lesson here isn't that the U.S. should have doubled down on regime change, it's that backing a single opposition figure without a viable path to power is a recipe for failure. The U.S. treated Guaidó like a chess piece, but in Venezuela's game, the board is rigged, and the pieces keep changing. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela's opposition is not a monolith. It's a collection of factions with competing agendas, and the U.S. has spent years trying to force them into a single, unified front. That's like trying to herd cats in a hurricane. You've got moderates like Enrique Capriles, who ran against Chavez in 2012 and Maduro in 2013, advocating for negotiations. You've got hardliners like Leopoldo López, who spent years in prison and exile, pushing for confrontation. And then you've got the younger generation, like Maria Corina Machado, who won the opposition's primary in 2023 with over 90% of the vote, only to be barred from running by Maduro's government. The U.S. has oscillated between supporting all of them, none of them, and some of them, depending on who's in the Oval Office. That inconsistency has left the opposition weaker, not stronger. Now, let's talk about Maduro. He's not stupid. He knows that the U.S. has the power to make his life miserable, but he also knows that the U.S. doesn't have the stomach for a full-scale invasion or even a sustained proxy war. So he plays a game of brinkmanship, tightening his grip on power just enough to survive, but never so much that he triggers a full-blown crisis. The 2020 parliamentary elections, which the opposition boycotted, were a masterclass in this strategy. Maduro's party won a supermajority, but the elections were widely seen as fraudulent. The U.S. condemned them, but what was the alternative? Recognizing a legislature that didn't exist? The 2024 presidential election is shaping up to be the same story. Maduro will rig it just enough to claim legitimacy, but not so much that it provokes a massive backlash. And the U.S. will be left with the same old: do we recognize the results, or do we double down on a failed strategy? The real question is whether the U.S. can break this cycle. And the answer depends on whether Washington is willing to accept a few hard truths. First, Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon. The man has survived sanctions, protests, coup attempts, and even a drone attack. He's outlasted every U.S. president since Obama, and he's not about to fold now. Second, the opposition isn't strong enough to overthrow him on its own. The 2019 uprising failed, the 2020 boycott backfired, and the 2023 primary victory was immediately undermined by Maduro's courts. Third, the Venezuelan people are exhausted. After years of hyperinflation, food shortages, and mass immigration, they're not clamoring for revolution, they're just trying to survive. That's why Machado's primary victory was so striking. She didn't win because she promised to overthrow Maduro. She won because she promised to fix the economy and restore basic services. That's a message the U.S. should be listening to. So what does a smarter U.S. policy look like? It starts with recognizing that Venezuela's crisis isn't just a political problem, it's an economic one. The country's GDP has shrunk by over 75% since 2013, and hyperinflation has wiped out the savings of millions. The US has tried to strangle the economy with sanctions, but all that's done is push Venezuela closer to Russia and China. In 2023, Venezuela signed a 20-year cooperation agreement with China, and Russia has been propping up Maduro with loans, arms sales, and even mercenaries. The US can't compete with that by just tightening the screws. It has to offer something better. Here's where the establishment will bristle. I'm not suggesting the US lift all sanctions tomorrow. But it should be willing to offer targeted relief in exchange for concrete concessions. For example, the US could ease sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector if Maduro agrees to allow international observers for the 2024 election. It could offer to unfreeze Venezuelan assets if the government releases political prisoners. It could even explore a phased reintegration of Venezuela into the global financial system if the opposition is given a real seat at the table. These aren't rewards, they're incentives. And they're a hell of a lot more effective than the current policy of hoping Maduro will just disappear. The other piece of this puzzle is the Venezuelan military. For years, the US has tried to peel off senior officers with the promise of amnesty or cash, but those efforts have mostly failed. That's because Maduro has done a masterful job of co-opting the military, turning it into a key pillar of his regime. The military controls everything from oil to food distribution, and its leaders have no incentive to defect. But that doesn't mean they're immune to pressure. The US could work with regional partners like Colombia and Brazil to offer a path to reintegration for mid-level officers who are tired of the status quo. It's a long shot, but it's better than the current approach of pretending the military doesn't exist. Now, I can already hear the objections. But Maduro will never agree to fair elections. The opposition will never accept a deal. This is just appeasement. To which I look at the alternatives. The status quo is a slow-motion disaster. Venezuela's population has shrunk by over 7 million people since 2015, one of the largest mass migrations in modern history. The country's infrastructure is collapsing, its institutions are hollowed out, and its society is deeply polarized. The US can either keep pretending that sanctions and isolation will somehow fix this, or it can try something different. Let's be, this isn't about liking Maduro or his regime. It's about recognizing that the US has limited leverage, and the way it's used that leverage hasn't worked. The Marshall Plan didn't work because the US was nice to Europe, it worked because it offered a way out of the abyss. The Iran deal didn't work because the US trusted the Ayatollahs, it worked because it offered a path to verifiable constraints. Venezuela needs the same way forward, not a dead end. The final piece of this puzzle is the US domestic political dimension. Venezuela policy has become a partisan football in Washington, and that's made it nearly impossible to have a coherent strategy. Under Trump, the US pursued a hardline approach, imposing sweeping sanctions and recognizing Guaido. Under Biden, the US has walked back some of that, but it's still stuck in the same old cycle of pressure and isolation. The problem is that neither party has an incentive to change course. For Republicans, Venezuela is a way to score points against socialism and appeasement. For Democrats, it's a way to signal toughness on human rights. Neither side wants to be the one to blink first. But here's the US public doesn't care about Venezuela. Poll after poll shows that foreign policy is a low priority for voters, and when it does come up, it's usually about China or Russia. That means there's no political cost to changing course. The question is whether the foreign policy establishment can overcome its own inertia. Can the US admit that its Venezuela policy has failed? Can it accept that Maduro is here to stay, at least for now? Can it pivot from regime change to engagement without looking weak? History suggests the answer is no. The US foreign policy machine is built to resist change, not embrace it. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. The alternative is more of the more suffering for the Venezuelan people, more Russian and Chinese influence in the region, and more instability that the US will eventually have to clean up. The US has spent years trying to force Venezuela to bend to its will. Maybe it's time to try something different. Maybe it's time to talk. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the broader collapse of U.S. grand strategy in Latin America. For decades, Washington operated under the assumption that the region was its backyard, a sphere of influence where it could dictate terms with minimal resistance. That assumption held true during the Cold War, when the U.S. could topple governments in Guatemala, Chile, and Nicaragua with little more than a nudge from Langley. But the world has changed. The Monroe Doctrine is dead, and the U.S. hasn't figured out what comes in. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela isn't an isolated case, it's a symptom of a larger failure. The U.S. has spent the last 20 years oscillating between neglect and overreach in Latin America. When it pays attention, it's usually to impose sanctions, back coups, or lecture leaders about democracy. When it doesn't, it's because the region isn't a priority compared to the Middle East or Asia. The result? A vacuum that Russia, China, and even Iran have been all too happy to fill. Moscow sends Wagner Group mercenaries to train Venezuelan troops. Beijing extends billions in loans, turning Caracas into a client state. Tehran uses Venezuela as a staging ground for its proxy networks. And the U.S.? It responds with strongly worded statements and the occasional submarine deployment. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. no longer has a coherent strategy for Latin America because it no longer understands the region. The old playbook, coups, sanctions, and military aid, doesn't work in an era where China can outbid the U.S. on infrastructure projects and Russia can outmaneuver it on information warfare. Take the case of Nicaragua. The U.S. sanctioned Daniel Ortega's regime into the ground, but instead of collapsing, he pivoted to China, which is now building a $50 billion canal that could rival the AMA Canal. Or look at Bolivia, where the U.S. spent years trying to undermine Evo Morales, only to see him replaced by a government that's just as anti-American but far more unstable. The problem isn't just that the U.S. is bad at grand strategy, it's that it's bad at learning from its mistakes. Every time a policy fails, the response is to double down. When Plan A doesn't work, the U.S. moves to Plan B, and when that fails, it's back to Plan A with more intensity. There's no Plan C, no off-ramp, no willingness to admit that maybe, just maybe, the U.S. doesn't have all the answers. The Iran deal proved that engagement can work, even with adversaries. The Cuba thaw under Obama showed that diplomacy can yield results, even if they're incremental. But those lessons have been forgotten, buried under a mountain of ideological rigidity. So what are the alternatives? The first is to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere and start treating Venezuela like a state, not a pariah. That doesn't mean lifting all sanctions overnight or endorsing his regime, it means creating a framework for conditional engagement. The U.S. could offer sanctions relief in exchange for verifiable democratic reforms, like free and fair elections monitored by international observers. It could work with allies to create a regional contact group, similar to the one that mediated the Colombia peace process, to push for a negotiated transition. And it could stop pretending that Juan Guaidó is the legitimate president of Venezuela when he hasn't set foot in the country in years. The second alternative is to recognize that the U.S. can't counter China and Russia in Latin America with military posturing alone. Beijing's influence in the region isn't built on aircraft carriers, it's built on ports, loans, and 5G networks. The U.S. needs to compete on those terms. That means reviving the kind of economic statecraft that defined U.S. policy in the 20th century, when the Marshall Plan and the Alliance for Progress turned former adversaries into allies. The Biden administration's America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity is a step in the right direction, but it's too little, too late. The U.S. needs to offer Latin America a real alternative to Chinese debt traps and Russian disinformation, one that doesn't come with lectures about democracy but with tangible benefits like trade deals, infrastructure investment, and technology transfers. The third alternative is to stop treating Latin America as a monolith. The region is a patchwork of different interests, ideologies, and histories. Mexico is not Colombia. Brazil is not Argentina. The U.S. can't have a one-size-fits-all policy when the challenges are so diverse. That means working with leftist governments like Lula's Brazil on climate change while pushing back against authoritarianism in Nicaragua. It means recognizing that some countries, like Chile and Uruguay, are natural allies, while others, like Venezuela and Cuba, will require a different approach. And it means accepting that the U.S. can't always be the one calling the shots. Now, I know what some of you are, but what about human rights? What about democracy? Those are valid concerns, but they can't be the only lens through which the US views the region. The US has a long history of supporting dictators when it suited its interests: Somoza in Nicaragua, Pinochet in Chile, the Shah in Iran. If the US is going to lecture others about democracy, it needs to be consistent. That means holding allies like Saudi Arabia and Egypt to the same standards as adversaries like Venezuela and Cuba. It means recognizing that sanctions often hurt the people they're supposed to help, as we've seen in Iraq, Iran, and now Venezuela. The final piece of this puzzle is the US domestic dimension. The biggest obstacle to a smarter Venezuela policy isn't Maduro or Putin, it's the US foreign policy establishment's refusal to admit failure. The same people who designed the Iraq War, the Libya intervention, and the failed Venezuela regime change strategy are still in charge. They've moved from one think tank to another, from one administration to the next, recycling the same tired ideas. The only way to break this cycle is to bring in fresh voices, people who understand the region, who speak the language, who aren't wedded to the old playbook. But here's the change: won't come from within. It never does. The US foreign policy machine is designed to resist disruption, not embrace it. Real change will only happen if the American public demands it. And that's the real tragedy. Because while Washington is stuck in its own echo chamber, the people of Venezuela are suffering. Millions have fled the country. Hyperinflation has destroyed the economy. The healthcare system has collapsed. And the US? It's still debating whether to send another submarine. At the end of the day, the question isn't whether the US can fix Venezuela. It's whether it can fix itself. Can it learn from its mistakes? Can it adapt to a world where it's no longer the sole superpower? Can it accept that sometimes the best way to lead is to listen? The answers to those questions will determine not just the future of Venezuela, but the future of US power in the 21st century. And right now, the signs aren't encouraging.